August 17th, 1943. Morning light over Bavaria. The air is unnaturally still until the first distant hum begins to tremble through it. It grows, second by second, into a rolling thunder. Farmers pause in their fields, windows rattle in small German towns. And then the sky changes. On the horizon, a black line appears, swelling as it moves east. Hundreds of aircraft, silver at first, then dark as they stack layer upon layer, fill the heavens. Engines beat together in a mechanical heartbeat that shakes the ground itself. At airfields near Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Luftwaffe pilots rush to their Messerschmitts. Some squint upward, counting 10, 50, 100, too many to count. Radio chatter erupts with disbelief. For the first time, the defenders of the Reich see what total war looks like from below. The sun is gone, swallowed by the formation of American B-17s, an airborne fortress armada crossing into the heart of Germany. And as the scramble sirens wail, one thought echoes among the German pilots. How do you fight the sky itself? In the early years of World War II, the Luftwaffe belonged to Germany. From the fall of Poland in 1939 to the lightning victory over France in 1940, the Luftwaffe had proven itself unmatched in speed, coordination, and precision. Its doctrine, close air support, dive bombing, and rapid strikes, was crafted for blitzkrieg, not defense. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Junkers U-87 Stukas had dominated continental skies, clearing the path for the Wehrmacht below. But across the Channel, a different idea was forming. While Britain reeled from the Blitz, its Royal Air Force began to see the air war not as support, but as a war in the self, a means to cripple an enemy's heart without ever setting foot on its soil. By 1942, London had embraced strategic bombing, striking industrial cities, railways, oil plants, the arteries of Hitler's war machine. Yet Britain's night raids, though vast, lacked precision. Even with improved navigation, darkness was both their shield and their limitation. Then came the Americans. When the U.S. 8th Air Force arrived in Britain in the summer of 1942, they brought not only new machines, but a different philosophy. American air doctrine preached daylight precision bombing, a dangerous belief that bombers, flying in tight formations, could hit factories with surgical accuracy using the Norden bomb sight. The theory promised that daylight raids could break Germany's industrial capacity while sparing civilians. It was a vision of clean war from above, one that reality would soon shatter. To make it work, the Americans relied on their newest heavy bomber, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a machine of metal and defiance. 4 powerful engines, 13 machine guns, armor plating around every vital part. Each one carried up to 4,000 pounds of bombs and 10 men, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, gunners. Its creators claimed it could defend itself against any fighter. Its crews would learn how wrong that was. As the first mission struck targets in occupied France and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe adjusted quickly. Their radar network, the Kammhuber line, tracked incoming formations long before they reached German airspace. Flak batteries along the coasts filled the sky with bursting black clouds, and squadrons of interceptors took off from dispersed airfields, ready to strike. But the Americans kept coming. Each month, their formations grew. Each mission, they flew a little deeper. The 8th Air Force's early raids in 1943 hit shipyards, U-boat pens, and factories from Lille to Bremen. For the German defenders, these were warning shots. The enemy was probing, learning, testing the Reich's defenses. Yet even then, the Luftwaffe command sensed the shift. Every bomber intercepted meant fuel burned, pilots lost, engines worn out. Germany's fighter force was being stretched thin from the Russian front to North Africa, from Sicily to Norway. And now, a new threat was gathering over England, a tide of silver aircraft building for something larger. By spring 1943, the Allies had proven they could strike by day, take losses, and return. The question was not if they would hit Germany's industrial core, but when. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces, warned that the Americans were unlike any enemy they'd faced. He said, "They will not stop. They will come again and again until the sky belongs to them." And so, in the summer of 1943, Berlin ordered a new defensive plan. Fighter groupings were redeployed to protect the industrial belt of central Germany, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Stuttgart, the beating heart of the Reich's aircraft and ball-bearing production. Yet for all the preparation, the Luftwaffe could not prepare for the scale that was coming. Intelligence reports showed hundreds of new bombers arriving in Britain every month. American airfields across East Anglia stretched to the horizon, rows of gleaming B-17s waiting for orders. The war in the air was no longer about daring raids or small formations. It was becoming something entirely else, an industrial clash of nations fought in the open sky. And at its center stood one belief, that the fortress bombers, in daylight, could break Hitler's empire from above. That belief would soon be tested over the factories of Schweinfurt and the airfields of Regensburg.
By mid-1943, England had become the world's largest aircraft carrier. Dozens of American bomber bases, Basingbourn, Kimballton, Thurley, Thorpe Abbotts, stretched across its green countryside like a web of concrete runways and steel hangars. Each morning, crews awoke before dawn, standing in lines outside briefing rooms that smelled of coffee, oil, and fear. Behind closed doors, commanders pinned red strings across vast maps of Europe. The targets were deep in the Reich: aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, synthetic oil refineries, the machinery that kept Hitler's armies moving. The B-17 and B-24 bombers that filled those runways represented the full weight of American industry. In 1943 alone, U.S. factories produced over 8,600 heavy bombers, outpacing all of Germany's aircraft production combined. Boeing plants in Seattle and Douglas lines in California ran day and night. The war in the air had become a test of industrial endurance. Who could build faster, repair faster, replace faster? But the human cost would be steep. A full daylight raid could last 8 to 10 hours. Crews flew at altitudes above 25,000 feet where the temperature dropped below -40. Frostbite was common. Oxygen masks froze. Enemy fighters could appear out of the sun at any moment, streaking in with cannon fire and disappearing just as quickly. The bombers' heavy defensive guns, 50 caliber Brownings mounted in turrets and waist positions, gave them a fighting chance, but only if they stayed together. This led to the creation of the combat box. It was a massive, layered formation of B-17s staggered in altitude and distance so that each aircraft's guns could cover the others. In theory, 100 bombers flying this way became one giant, self-defending fortress. The geometry of death, drawn in the sky. Yet the Luftwaffe adapted quickly. German pilots began coordinated attacks using swarms of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, approaching from the front where bombers were most vulnerable. They carried 20mm and 30mm cannon shells that could tear through a B-17's fuselage in seconds. Then came the heavy flak. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns defended German cities and industrial centers. Their bursts filled the sky with black clouds, each explosion timed to the second by radar-controlled predictors. Crews described it as flying through a storm of steel, the air thick with shrapnel, the concussions hammering the planes from all sides. Still, the Americans pressed deeper. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force had struck Bremen, Kiel, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley. Each mission came at terrible cost, dozens of bombers lost, hundreds of men missing. But the raids proved something crucial. Germany could be reached by day. And in Washington and London, that fact changed everything. If the Allies could destroy Germany's aircraft factories and cripple its ball-bearing production, the Luftwaffe would collapse, leaving the skies open for a future invasion of Europe. That was the logic behind Operation Point Blank, the combined Allied strategy to eliminate the Luftwaffe's capacity to resist before D-Day. But in Berlin, Hermann Göring and his staff were preparing a counterpunch. They knew the Americans would eventually target the industrial hubs of southern Germany. Schweinfurt, home to the world's largest ball-bearing factories, was essential. Every German tank, aircraft, and vehicle depended on them. Regensburg, further south, was critical for producing the Me-109 fighter, the Luftwaffe's workhorse. Defending these targets became a national priority. Radar lines were reinforced. Fighter wings were repositioned. Experienced aces, many veterans of the Eastern Front, were recalled to home defense. Yet beneath the surface, the Reich was already bleeding. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and engine wear plagued the Luftwaffe. Factories repaired aircraft faster than they could replace trained men. And across the Channel, the Americans were about to unleash the largest daylight raid in history. It would be a two-pronged assault, a double strike designed to stretch the Luftwaffe beyond breaking point. One way would hit Regensburg, destroying the Me-109 production plant, and then continue to North Africa. The second would follow hours later, striking Schweinfurt and returning to England. It was a bold, almost reckless plan. 200 miles of German airspace, no fighter escort, and the enemy waiting. The morning of August 17, 1943, was chosen. Weather forecasts promised clear skies, perfect for daylight bombing. At dawn, crews assembled in briefing halls across East Anglia. Cigarettes burned slowly as the curtain lifted from the target map. 2 red lines, one to Regensburg, one to Schweinfurt. The room fell silent. Then came the words they all dreaded. "Gentlemen, this will be a maximum effort." Outside, engines began to start, rumbling like distant thunder. The decisive test of the daylight bombing campaign was about to begin. 1. The human angle. For the men who climbed into the flying fortresses that August morning, war was measured not in victories, but in miles. Every 1,000 feet higher meant colder air, thinner oxygen, and a smaller chance of coming home. Each B-17 carried 10 men, young, mostly in their early 20s, some barely 19. They had names like Memphis Belle, Hell's Angels, Miss Wichita. The nose art was a defiance of mortality, a painted promise that maybe luck could be earned. Before takeoff, ground crews performed their rituals, tapping the fuselage for good fortune, checking every gun and engine. They watched the bombers taxi one by one down the runway, engines roaring, propellers blurring the morning mist. When the last tail lifted, the airfield fell silent. The ground men always said the same thing. That's the last we'll see of some of them. Inside the aircraft, it was another world. At 25,000 feet, the temperature could drop to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Frost formed on the walls, oxygen masks froze, and every breath came through a thin rubber tube. The men wore thick fleece suits, electrically heated gloves, and heavy boots that barely kept the cold at bay. When enemy fighters appeared, everything happened at once. The intercom exploded with shouts, "Bandits, 3 o'clock high!" and the gunners swung into motion. Waist gunners fired until their gloves stiffened with ice. Turret gunners rotated endlessly, their world reduced to the curve of plexiglass and the sound of their own heartbeat. They were trapped inside metal rooms, watching their friends in neighboring bombers torn apart by cannon fire or flak bursts. There was no cover, no escape, only the endless drone of engines and the black blossoms of anti-aircraft shells growing closer. And still they flew forward, because behind them were their homes, their families, their country's faith that they could bring the war to an end. For the German fighter pilots, it was not courage that failed, it was the scale of what they faced. From the moment they took off, their radios filled with orders and coordinates. Controllers tracked the incoming bomber streams by radar, directing squadrons into position. Once visual contact was made, the sky filled with movement, hundreds of aircraft weaving contrails across the blue. Many of these German pilots were aces, men like Egon Meyer, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Walter Dahl, veterans of the Eastern Front. But they had never seen anything like this. Each attack meant diving headlong into a fortress wall of guns, a torrent of tracers from dozens of bombers firing in every direction. Some pilots described it as flying into a furnace. The Luftwaffe called it Terror der Himmel, the terror of the sky. 2. The tactical angle. The Americans believed formation flying was their shield. A bomber alone was a target. 1,000 together were a weapon. Each combat box formation was meticulously calculated. Altitude, distance, field of fire. Every gun on a B-17 overlapped with others. From afar, the formation looked slow and ponderous. Up close, it was a shifting fortress bristling with steel. German pilots, however, adapted their tactics with brutal logic. The head-on attack became their signature. They discovered that a frontal pass, coming straight at the formation at 600 kilometers per hour, minimized their exposure to defensive fire while giving them a direct shot at the cockpit and nose. To face that, bomber crews needed ice in their veins. The sight of fighters rushing directly at them was almost unbearable. The first instinct was to duck, but if a gunner flinched even for a second, the enemy would break through. As the bombers crossed into central Germany, waves of Luftwaffe interceptors would rotate in. Bf-109s first, then FW-190s, then twin-engine Zerstorer heavy fighters, firing rockets and cannon shells from a distance. The Germans called it Abschusswelle, the kill wave. American gunners learned to fight in rhythm, timing their bursts to conserve ammunition, shouting bearings and ranges over the intercom. The roar of engines mixed with the metallic clang of shell casings bouncing off the floor. Flak bursts followed, black puffs that bracketed the formation, closer each minute. "Flak at 9 o'clock, the navigator would call. "Hold course." They couldn't swerve. Any deviation risked breaking the box and leaving others exposed. From below, the Germans watched the bombers hold formation through that storm, unflinching, mechanical, relentless. It was not bravery alone, it was discipline, drilled into every crew, every machine. The 3. The technological angle. The Flying Fortress was more than a bomber. It was a statement of American engineering faith. Its frame was designed to absorb punishment and still fly. Crews told stories of B-17s limping home with engines destroyed, tails shredded, even sections of the wing missing. The secret to its success was redundancy. 4 engines meant 1 or even 2 could fail and the aircraft would still make it home. Armor plating shielded the cockpit and vital systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire. And then there was the Norden bomb sight, a gyroscopically stabilized targeting system so advanced that bombardiers were required to swear an oath to protect its secrets. They believed it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. In reality, high-altitude wind and flak made precision elusive, but it was still the most advanced aiming device of its time. Every part of the fortress reflected America's industrial confidence. Thousands of rivets, miles of wiring, hydraulic turrets controlled by electric motors. When these machines filled the sky, they carried not just bombs, but the belief that technology itself could conquer distance, weather, and fear. For the Germans below, the sound of those engines became the new language of war. Constant, deep, and unstoppable. And above the roar of the air battles, one question began to haunt both sides. Would human courage and steel machines be enough to decide who owned the sky? The answer would come soon, in fire, metal, and smoke, over the heart of Germany.
4. The leadership angle. At the top of the American chain of command stood men of vision and conviction. Major General Ira C. Aker, commander of the 8th Air Force, believed in daylight precision bombing with a near-religious certainty. He was calm, analytical, and stubborn, a man who trusted mathematics and discipline more than luck. Aker's strategy was shaped by General Henry Hap Arnold, the architect of America's air power. Arnold envisioned the bomber not as support for the Army, but as the spearhead of modern warfare, capable of destroying an enemy's capacity to fight before a single soldier landed on a beach. It was, in essence, a promise that technology could replace attrition. But others doubted. Within the Allied command, voices warned that unescorted daylight raids deep into Germany would bleed the Air Force dry. Even Arthur Harris, the British Marshal of Bomber Command, who oversaw the brutal night raids on Hamburg and Berlin, called Aker's plan murderous optimism. Aker stood firm. "The bomber will always get through," he said, echoing a phrase that had become both prophecy and curse. In 1944, leadership would pass to General Jimmy Doolittle, famous for the Tokyo raid. Unlike Aker, Doolittle embraced aggressive change. He pushed for the introduction of long-range escorts, the P-51 Mustang, and rewrote tactics to give fighter pilots freedom to hunt the Luftwaffe rather than guard formations. But in 1943, that shift had not yet come. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid would be flown under Aker's command, a mission defined by faith in the bomber and the men who flew them. Across the front lines, another leader watched the skies with growing dread. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, once the proud architect of the Luftwaffe, now faced the slow unraveling of his creation. In the early years of the war, he had promised Hitler that no enemy would ever reach German soil by air. By 1943, the promise was collapsing above him in black smoke and contrails. Every day, he received reports of new raids, new losses. His fighter squadrons were stretched from Sicily to Stalingrad. His factories could build planes faster than his schools could train pilots. And now the Americans were coming in daylight, visible, defiant, unstoppable. "Where are my fighters?" Hitler demanded after every raid. Göring had no answer. Leadership on both sides had become a war of will. Aker fought to prove his doctrine right. Göring fought to prove it hadn't failed. Both would be tested in the sky over southern Germany. 5. The enemy angle. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm, once the most feared in the world, was bleeding. By 1943, many of its best pilots had been killed or exhausted after years of continuous combat. Those who remained faced an enemy that grew stronger every month. To meet the American raids, the Luftwaffe developed an intricate defensive network. Radar stations tracked the incoming formations. Controllers in bunkers coordinated hundreds of fighters, vectoring them to intercept points. Ground observers relayed positions, altitudes, and headings. At first, it worked. The bomber streams were predictable. They followed straight, timed routes. Luftwaffe Gruppen could launch, climb, and strike in successive waves. The Americans called it running the gauntlet. But as the raids increased, cracks began to show. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement aircraft arrived with mechanical faults.
Young pilots, barely out of flight school, were sent against formations of hundreds of bombers, each bristling with guns. German ace Adolf Galland described the sensation of attacking a bomber stream as throwing yourself against a moving wall of fire. The reward for success was survival. The penalty for hesitation was death. Desperation drove innovation. The Luftwaffe experimented with heavy armament, 37mm and 50mm cannons mounted on twin-engine fighters, rocket projectiles that could scatter bomber formations, even ramming tactics. One pilot, Heinrich Erler, famously said, "You don't aim at a bomber, you aim at the mass." But nothing could change the math. For every German fighter destroyed, another 3 would take off from English airfields the next week. For every pilot killed, it took 6 months to train one replacement. Still, they fought with unmatched determination. To many, defending the Reich had become personal. Their families lived under those blackening skies. Yet even as they fought, a chilling realization spread among them. The tide of war was turning. The invader was no longer at the gates. He was above them. 6. The moral angle. As the war in the air intensified, so did the moral questions surrounding it. Strategic bombing was born from logic. Destroy industry and you cripple the enemy's capacity to wage war. But in practice, those factories were surrounded by workers' homes, schools, hospitals. Every precision raid risked devastating the cities below. The Americans insisted they bombed only military targets. The Norden bomb site, they said, allowed accuracy within a few hundred feet. But at 25,000 feet, in crosswinds and flak bursts, bombs rarely fell exactly where intended. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants were surrounded by neighborhoods. Regensburg's aircraft factories bordered residential areas. When the bombs fell, they did not distinguish between machinist and civilian. The moral burden weighed heavily on some aircrew, who returned from missions often asked not about their accuracy, but about what they had destroyed. Others convinced themselves of necessity, that ending the war sooner would save more lives in the long run. On the ground, civilians saw no such distinction. To them, the endless drone of engines was terror itself, a sound that meant homes would soon crumble and families would scatter to the shelters. By late 1943, the German people began to understand that no wall of propaganda could protect them from the sky. And among the Allied ranks, the question persisted: how far could civilization go in the pursuit of victory? The answer, as history would show, would not be found in words, but in the fire that consumed Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The stage was set. The bombers were ready. The defenders waited. The decisive day had arrived.
August 17th, 1943, 0400 hours. Across the quiet English countryside, engines began to start. From Bassingbourn to Thorpe Abbotts, from Kimballton to Ridgewell, thousands of men climbed into their aircraft under a pale dawn. Each bomber was loaded to its limits: 5,000 pounds of bombs, full fuel tanks, machine guns ready. Ground crews gave last checks. Pilots lit cigarettes with trembling hands. Then the first B-17 rolled down the runway, its 4 engines straining under the weight. By 0600, more than 370 flying fortresses were airborne, a sky-spanning armada bound for Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Below them, English villages woke to a sound that had become the anthem of war: the deep, rolling thunder of hundreds of engines blending into one endless note. The formations climbed through thin mist into the rising sun, leveling off above 25,000 feet. The bombers' silver bodies caught the light, glittering like a river of metal stretching east toward the continent. In their cockpits, the airmen adjusted oxygen masks, checked instruments, and tried not to think about the hours ahead. They knew the statistics. Each mission over Germany had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of survival. Today's mission would carry them farther and deeper than any before. Crossing the North Sea. The first leg was silent, mechanical, endless. Over the North Sea, the bombers flew in tight combat boxes, radio chatter minimal, the cold creeping into their bones. Below them stretched only waves, gray, endless, indifferent. As they neared the Dutch coast, the first warnings crackled through the German air defense network. Radar stations along the coast, Freya and Würzburg arrays, picked up vast signatures moving east. At the German command centers, the radar operators stared at their screens in disbelief. This was no probing raid. This was an invasion of the sky. Telephones rang across occupied Europe. Feindverband entdeckt, enemy formation detected. Sirens wailed at Luftwaffe airfields from Holland to Bavaria. Pilots ran from barracks to flight lines. Mechanics pulled chocks from under Messerschmitts. Propellers blurred to life. The Luftwaffe was scrambling to meet the threat. But the bombers kept coming, formation after formation, wave after wave, crossing the coastline into enemy territory. The first interceptions. At 9:30, the first German fighters made contact near Aachen. Bf 109s dived from above, their engines screaming, cannons flashing. Tracer rounds sliced through the sky, tearing into the leading formations. Inside the bombers, the world became chaos. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high," shouted gunners. The air erupted with machine gun fire. The steady thrum of engines was drowned by the hammering of 50-caliber guns. A B-17 named Marie Jane took a direct hit to the wing and erupted in flames. Crewmen bailed out through smoke and fire, parachutes opening like white flowers against the blue. Moments later, another fortress spiraled downward, its tail sheared off. The formation tightened. The surviving aircraft closed ranks. Every gun fired, side, tail, turret, nose, a storm of tracers forming a lethal cage around them. But the German pilots kept coming. They dived head-on through that cage, firing short bursts, breaking away at the last instant. The sky filled with contrails, explosions, and fragments of metal tumbling in the sun. For every bomber destroyed, another held its course, steady and unwavering. The training took over. Hands on controls, eyes on instruments, formation discipline absolute. The gunners barely noticed how many enemy fighters they shot down. They were too busy staying alive. Over Regensburg. By 10:30, the Regensburg group reached its target. After 3 hours of combat, they were deep in southern Germany, exhausted, frostbitten, and still under attack. Below them lay the Messerschmitt factories, vast complexes of steel and glass where the Bf 109 fighter was built, the very machines that had been tearing through their ranks only minutes before. Bomb bay doors opened. The wind roared into the cabins as bombardiers took control. Through the Norden bomb site, the world below appeared as a drifting pattern of streets and hangars. Crosshairs aligned, altitude corrected, timing precise. Bombs away! One by one, the fortresses released their payloads. 1,000 bombs fell in perfect sequence, glittering as they dropped, then erupted in pillars of smoke and fire. The Regensburg complex vanished in a rolling wave of explosions. Secondary fires broke out across the city as fuel depots ignited. Below, the German anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the sky, unable to reach the high-flying bombers with accuracy. The mission had succeeded, but there was no return flight for this wave. Instead of turning back to England, they continued south over the Alps toward North Africa, avoiding another pass through Germany's air defenses. The men in those bombers had done their part, but the battle was far from over. The Schweinfurt Group. Back over central Germany, the second formation, bound for Schweinfurt, pressed on alone. They were now the sole focus of the Luftwaffe's fury. Every available fighter was thrown against them. Dozens of Bf-109s and FW-190s rose in coordinated attacks. The German pilots, many running low on ammunition or fuel, made desperate passes through the bomber stream. Flak over Schweinfurt was intense, the heaviest yet encountered. The air was black with bursts, each explosion shaking the bombers like a hammer blow. Yet they held their formation. Each aircraft dropped its load precisely on the sprawling ball bearing factories below. Through the clouds of smoke, fire spread across the industrial complex. Machine shops, warehouses, rail yards, all burning together. But the cost was terrible. As the bombers turned for home, 1 in every 5 had been hit. Engines smoking, wings shredded. Some flew on 3 engines, others on 2. The Luftwaffe pursued them all the way back across Germany. For hours the battle continued, a running gauntlet of flak and fire. When the surviving bombers finally crossed the Dutch coast, their gunners were silent, ammunition spent. Inside many aircraft, the floor was slick with hydraulic fluid and blood. Behind them, the German countryside burned. Ahead of them, the sea stretched endless and gray. The sky over Germany that day had been transformed into a battlefield of machines and courage, where sunlight flickered through the clouds of smoke and thousands of men fought for control of the air. But the day was not yet done. The heaviest losses and the deepest realizations were still to come. The smoke of Schweinfurt still rose behind them when the German fighters returned. They came in waves, from above, from below, from the sun, darting through the gaps between bombers like wolves through a herd. Every fortress that fell left another exposed. Every gun that fell silent opened a hole in the wall. Inside the formations, the men fought exhaustion and terror. They had been in combat for more than 6 hours. Their hands were blistered from the recoil of their guns, their faces frostbitten, their oxygen low. The intercom crackled with fragments of speech, half-shouted warnings, clipped acknowledgments, prayers disguised as radio checks. Tail gunners saw what the pilots could not, aircraft trailing smoke, spinning, breaking apart in mid-air. They watched parachutes open, counted them, and knew how many didn't. A B-17 named Murder, Inc. took a direct hit in the bomb bay. Flames engulfed the fuselage. The crew fought to jettison the bombs before the fire reached them. A moment later, the entire aircraft vanished in a single orange flash. Nearby, Skipper 2 flew home with its nose torn away, the bombardier's compartment completely exposed to the wind. The navigator was gone. The pilot flew with one hand, holding the controls steady, while the other pressed a tourniquet to his co-pilot's arm. These were scenes repeated across the sky, courage and chaos intertwined, thousands of feet above a land they could barely see through the smoke. German desperation. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the battle was equally brutal. They had taken off knowing the odds, 10 bombers for every fighter, each bomber armed with a dozen heavy guns. By midday, ammunition was running low. Many fighters had been hit by return fire. Engines smoked, wings were riddled, yet they turned again, climbing back for another pass. Adolf Galland later wrote that the scale of the formation defied comprehension. It was as if a city had taken flight. The air itself seemed filled with aircraft. You could not see the end of it. German radio networks crackled with confusion. Controllers struggled to coordinate hundreds of interceptors spread across the country. The bomber stream stretched for miles, too vast to attack at once. At one point near Würzburg, German squadrons tried mass head-on attacks, hoping to break the formation's front line. Some succeeded, Bombers disintegrated in midair, their debris cascading downward like falling stars. But every time a gap opened, the remaining fortresses closed it instantly, maintaining the iron geometry of the combat box. From the ground, civilians watched the strange spectacle, the blue sky carved by white contrails, the sun dimmed by the drifting haze of smoke and aluminum fragments. Many had never seen such numbers in the air at once. It seemed less a battle than a storm, one made of men and machines instead of clouds. The long way home. By early afternoon, the bombers began the return leg. The air over Germany shimmered with heat and burning oil. Fires raged across Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The surviving formations, tattered and scattered, turned northwest toward the safety of the North Sea. But the Luftwaffe was not finished. German fighters regrouped near Kassel, launching final attacks as the bombers struggled home. Some pilots were down to their last rounds. Others rammed damaged planes into the formation, desperate to bring one more enemy down. The 8th Air Force paid dearly. 60 bombers were lost outright. Dozens more limped back across the channel, riddled with holes. When the first fortresses reached England late that afternoon, the ground crews could scarcely believe what they saw. Some aircraft landed on one engine. Others touched down with landing gear jammed, bellies scraping sparks across the runways. One plane's tail gunner was found frozen solid at his post, hands still gripping the triggers. At Thorpe Abbotts, a B-17 called the Duchess returned with 300 bullet holes, no radio, no hydraulics, and 9 of its 10 crew still alive. They stepped down from the hatch, dazed, bloodied, silent. One of them simply said, "There were so many of them, so many." The mission had cost the 8th Air Force nearly 600 men, killed, wounded, or missing. It was the heaviest single-day loss the Americans had suffered in the air war to that point. The moment of realization. For the Germans, victory felt hollow. Yes, they had destroyed dozens of bombers. Yes, the skies over Bavaria had been cleared for now. But as the smoke cleared, a darker truth became visible. Even with their losses, the Americans had reached both targets. They had bombed Regensburg's aircraft factories and Schweinfurt's ball bearing plants with devastating effect. And they had done it in daylight through the full strength of the Luftwaffe. In Berlin, Hermann Göring stared out from his office at the faint contrails still lingering high above. He told his staff, "They will never come again." But deep down, he knew the opposite was true. They would come again, in greater numbers, with longer range, with escorts that would one day sweep his fighters from the sky entirely. Among the German pilots who survived that day, the realization spread like a shadow. The sight of the bomber stream, endless, implacable, darkening the horizon, had burned itself into their memories. One recalled, years later, "It was not a battle, it was a visitation. The sky itself was against us." The raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg marked a turning point, a brutal revelation that the air war had entered a new phase. The Germans had defended bravely, but could not destroy the tide. The Americans had struck powerfully, but at an unbearable cost. The skies of Europe would never be the same again. The smoke of that day still hung over Germany when both sides began counting their dead and asking the same question. Was it worth it? By dawn on August 18th, the Great Raid was over. The engines were silent, the skies empty again. Across England, at airfields scattered through Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, the survivors were counted one by one. In some squadrons, nearly half the aircraft that had taken off the previous morning never returned. Empty revetments stood where bombers had once parked. Ground crews waited long after radio silence fell, scanning the horizon for planes that would never appear.
Of the 376 B-17s that had departed England, 60 were gone. Many others crash-landed across the Channel or in neutral Switzerland. Some limped into bases in North Africa, engines ruined, crews barely conscious. In the debriefing huts, the returning airmen sat wordless, faces gray with exhaustion. Officers handed them coffee laced with brandy and tried to take their reports. They spoke in fragments about fire, about smoke, about the sky filled with black puffs of flak. One gunner simply drew a circle on his mission chart and said, "They were all around us." Counting the cost. The official figures told a brutal story. Of the 2,900 airmen who had flown the mission, approximately 590 were lost, killed or missing in action. Hundreds of others were wounded. The 8th Air Force had inflicted serious damage. The Regensburg Messerschmitt plant was heavily hit, halting fighter production for several weeks. Schweinfurt's ball bearing factories were crippled, cutting supplies for Germany's war industry by nearly 40%. But the cost stunned Allied command. Each B-17 represented men, training, machinery, months of preparation. 60 gone meant 600 men vanished in a single day. At the 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, General Ira Eaker reviewed the after-action reports with grim silence. The numbers were undeniable. Without long-range fighter escort, daylight raids deep into Germany were unsustainable. The bombers could fight bravely, but they could not fight alone. Eaker sent a message to Washington that evening. Losses heavy, morale high, but continued operations of this depth will soon deplete our strength. It was both a warning and a promise. The men would go again if ordered, but the cost would break them before it broke Germany. Inside the Reich. Across the Channel, the German response was complex, part triumph, part unease. The Luftwaffe celebrated the destruction of so many bombers. Propaganda called it a decisive victory. But those who had fought in the air knew better. When the Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes flew over Regensburg and Schweinfurt the next day, the photographs told a darker truth. Entire factory blocks had been flattened. Rows of machines stood twisted and burned. Transport links were shattered. At Regensburg, production ceased for weeks. At Schweinfurt, replacement parts had to be shipped from scattered facilities across Germany. Ball bearing shortages rippled through the war economy, delaying tanks, aircraft, and vehicles. In Berlin, the news reached Göring, who had boasted months earlier that no enemy bomber will ever fly over the Reich. Now, he studied the photographs in silence. The bombers had flown over. They had bombed in daylight. And, despite terrible losses, they had succeeded. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's high command understood that the war in the air could not be won by interception alone. They'd inflicted massive casualties, but failed to stop the attack itself. Echoes across Europe. In the days that followed, the German people saw the results firsthand. In Regensburg, workers dug through rubble where assembly lines had once stood. In Schweinfurt, factory women sorted through twisted bearings by hand, trying to salvage anything usable. The smell of burned oil and metal lingered for weeks. To many civilians, the scale of the raid was terrifying, a sign that nowhere inside Germany was truly safe anymore. Rumors spread that thousands more bombers were being prepared in England, that the next wave would come without warning, in daylight, again and again. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, the victory felt hollow. They'd fought with courage and skill, but the sheer number of enemy aircraft had shaken them. One veteran wrote in his diary, "We were hunters once. Now we are prey to something larger than we can destroy." The illusion of control had vanished. Germany had faced the full industrial force of the United States and realized it was only the beginning. But even in victory, the Allies faced hard questions of their own. Could they keep sending men into skies that had devoured so many?
And what would it take to ensure those losses were not in vain? Those questions haunted commanders through the autumn of 1943 and led directly to the next phase of the air war. In the weeks after the raid, the hangars of eastern England filled with silence. The smell of burned oil still hung over the dispersal grounds. New bombers arrived, but their crews were green, replacements for those who had vanished over Germany. In briefing rooms, commanders laid out new charts and maps. The red pins marking Schweinfurt and Regensburg were still there, but now there were long, cautious lines drawn only as far as the Ruhr or coastal France. The 8th Air Force had learned its lesson. Deep penetration raids without escort were suicide. General Eaker and his staff began pushing urgently for a solution, a fighter that could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, their current escort, lacked the range. It could protect the bombers only halfway into Germany before turning back for lack of fuel. When it left, the Luftwaffe closed in. In late 1943, attention turned to a new aircraft, the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally a British design, it had shown remarkable speed and endurance when fitted with the Rolls-Royce engine. With drop tanks, it could fly to Berlin and home again. The Mustang was fast enough to chase German interceptors, agile enough to dogfight them, and armed heavily enough to kill them. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg disaster had given the Allies the proof they needed. Escort fighters were not optional, they were essential. Strategic reassessment. In Washington and London, debates raged within Allied command. Some officers argued that daylight bombing was too costly, that the RAF's night campaign was the safer course. Others insisted that only daylight raids could deliver the precision needed to cripple German industry. The Schweinfurt and Regensburg losses hardened both camps. For now, the deep strikes were halted. Instead, the Americans concentrated on nearer targets, airfields, transport hubs, and synthetic oil plants in western Germany and occupied France. The bombers would not return to Schweinfurt for months. But the intelligence reports told a powerful story. Despite the factory's quick recovery, the Germans had been shaken. Production had been disrupted, and resources diverted from the front lines to repair bombed-out industrial centers. Even with their losses, the Americans had forced the Luftwaffe to fight a defensive war over its own soil, a war of attrition it could not win. The turning tide. By early 1944, the P-47 Mustang entered combat in large numbers. The transformation was immediate. Now, when the bombers crossed into Germany, the Mustangs flew with them, first above, then among, and finally far ahead of the formations. German fighters that climbed to intercept were ambushed before they reached the bombers. Within months, Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. Veteran pilots like Adolf Galland realized that the tide had turned. The moment we lost control of the air over Germany, the war was lost. The seeds of that loss had been planted months earlier, on that August day in 1943, when the sky turned black over Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The Germans had won the battle, but at the cost of revealing their vulnerability. Every analysis of radar intercepts, every after-action report, every gun camera film pointed to the same conclusion. Germany could not stop the bombers forever. Not when America could build them faster than they could be destroyed. Psychological wounds. For the men who flew that mission, the scars ran deep. Many returned to fly again, but few spoke about that day afterward. In the debriefing reports, phrases like intense opposition, heavy flak, and formation decimated appear again and again. Clinical words for experiences beyond language. One pilot later recalled, "When I close my eyes, I still see the contrails, the smoke, the falling planes. It looked like the world itself was coming apart. Yet despite the trauma, morale did not collapse. If anything, the raid hardened the resolve of the airmen. They had faced the full fury of the Reich and survived. By the spring of 1944, with Mustangs overhead and their formation stronger than ever, those same bomber crews returned to the heart of Germany. They would bomb Berlin in daylight. They would erase the myth of German invincibility once and for all. Germany's air war unraveled. For the Luftwaffe, the months after the Regensburg raid were the beginning of the end. Every new factory rebuilt was bombed again. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. By the summer of 1944, German air defense was collapsing under unrelenting assault. The sky that had once belonged to the hunters now belonged to the hunted. What had begun as terror, the sight of endless bombers blotting out the sun, became a grim routine. The defenders no longer asked if the bombers would come, but when. And each time they came, there were more of them. The echoes of Schweinfurt and Regensburg would shape the rest of the war. The lessons written in smoke that day became the foundation of Allied air superiority and the slow, unstoppable destruction of Nazi Germany's war machine. But when the last fires burned out and the last casualty reports were written, one question still lingered among those who had fought it. Had the price of dominance been too high to bear? The next and final part, the reflection and closure, will bring calm after the storm. A cinematic, human meditation on what this battle meant for the men who fought it, for the evolution of air warfare, and for the moral weight of commanding the skies. The fires of Schweinfurt and Regensburg faded long ago. The wreckage was cleared, the factories rebuilt, the fields sown again. But high above, in the invisible corridors of the past, that August sky still exists. A moment when courage and machinery collided on a scale the world had never seen. For the German pilots who rose to meet the bombers, it was the day they first glimpsed the shape of defeat. Not in battle lines or broken cities, but in the sheer immensity of an enemy's industrial will. They fought bravely, but no skill could match the endless production lines of Detroit and Seattle. For the American crews, it was the day war became personal. Not just targets and coordinates, but faces and screams inside burning planes. They learned that victory in the air came at a cost written in blood and steel, a cost that could only be measured in the silence after landing, when the roll call began and names went unanswered. And for the world, it was the day the sky itself became a battlefield. The sight of thousands of bombers crossing continents changed how nations understood power and how fragile humanity could seem beneath the machinery it had built. From that day onward, warfare would never again be fought only on the ground. It would belong to the air, to those who could command it, survive it, or endure its consequences. And as history looks back on that moment, when German pilots stared upward in awe and fear as the sky turned black with bombers, it stands both as a triumph of human ingenuity and a warning of its cost.